'67, I took a Polaroid camera to a Red Sox game and got all those old Polaroid color pictures with these little ants, and I was trying to figure out which Red Sox that was. By virtue of another coincidence, I went to Mass College of Art, which was down the street from Fenway. The bleachers were $2. I was the first full-time photo major at Mass Art in 1970, and I was put on independent study for the whole time I was there. So, needless to say, that's where I was, Fenway Park. Boston Magazine in 1974 gave Fenway best place in Boston to get high, so that didn't separate itself from my causes either. But I kind of got out of baseball for a while and just pursued the job I was doing. And during the 80s, I had some very serious health problems. I wound up in a coma and for a couple of months. And when I came to, they said, you need to pay us $250,000. That will allow us to give you a heart transplant. If you don't have a heart transplant, you will live 6 months. And there was no way I could raise that kind of money, so I thought, well, I can sit in my room or do what I did, which is get a knapsack and a camera, and I took a train out to Wrigley Field. John McGonigal dropped me off at the train. I really didn't think I was going to come back. I remember being at Wrigley Field, and the sun was out. I'm standing there and saying, well, you survived all this. And I realized that I couldn't move my leg. So I thought, well, I'm having a stroke right here, which is what they warned me about. And who's going to take care of my cat? My brother's going to be really angry because he's going to have to fly me back. And then I realized that my foot was stuck in gum. So I didn't think quite so seriously after that. But from Chicago, I went to all the Major League Baseball parks in succession, as many as I could afford to do at a time. I did a circuit. I did a circuit down south. I jumped on a plane, went to San Diego, saw all 6 ballparks up the coast via Amtrak. I saw San Diego, the Los Angeles Angels, Los Angeles Dodgers, the Oakland A's, the San Francisco Giants, and went to Seattle. It took 2 weeks. The planets that aligned in all those parks. We're at home during that trip. And once I finished with the majors, it was 2 or 3 years, and I was still on the planet, so I started on the minors. And worked for the Pawtucket Red Sox for a long time, 15 years. But I went to another group of minor league parks. I think all told I've been to 50 or 60. I lost track somewhere along the line. But in 1995 or 1996, Tony Deaconess had an exhibit of Ernest Withers' Negro League photographs at his gallery on Bay State Road. And I had always had an interest in the players in baseball. Of course, the Red Sox were the last team to integrate. They didn't integrate for 11 years after Jackie Robinson broke the color line. And I actually did see their player, Pumpsie Green, play in 1962. So I was very well aware of the Negro Leagues and the struggles that were involved. And I had never seen anything like earnest groups of photographs of those players in the 40s and 50s in my life. And I dragged everybody I knew there. You got to come and see this. You got to come and see this. And I went to hear Ernest speak, and I was too embarrassed to ask him a question because I figured, well, I'll ask something stupid. And so I never did. But I had occasion to be in Memphis to photograph something for the Paw Sox in 2002. And I took a gamble, and I called him up, and he was at a funeral photographing, and I apologized. I was so embarrassed, and he said, we must deal with things as they occur. It didn't rattle him at all. He asked me to meet him at his studio, and I figured he would say hello to me and then just send me on my way. But he didn't. He asked me to go to an event with him. It was a all-black caucus somewhere, and I was 50 or something, but I was still wide-eyed at all of this going on. He took his camera and he rammed me with it. Load that! And I thought, oh God, if I ever mess this up. But he took me all over town that day. He took me to where Martin Luther King had been waked, brought me right down the aisle and put his hands on my shoulders and said, "This is where I stood when I took the photograph." He took me to the Masonic Temple where King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, and brought me up to the podium and said, and he just drove me around that day and told me all kinds of stories. And at the end of the day, he dropped me off at my hotel, and he said, "You know, you may be the devil, but I'll take my chances." And the next morning, he called me up and said, "This is Ernest Withers. Would you like to help me photograph today?" And I spent the rest of the time I was there with him. And over the course of the 5 years, until he passed in 2007, I was in Memphis 12 times with him. And he was also up here many times to speak. Tony represented him at Panopticon. And we became friends. I just rode around in his car and listened to his stories and never asked him anything because I knew that would upset him greatly. But I used to come home to my hotel and take notes on everything he said. And he told me about Otis Redding. He took me to a church janitor's closet where Aretha Franklin almost got caught making out with Sam Cooke. I mean, he knew all these stars of Memphis when they were young. He took me to Al Green's church. He knew Elvis when Elvis was very young. One of his most famous pictures is Elvis at 23 and B.B. King at 24 when they were together. He was a staunch defender of Elvis not being a racist. And it was just an experience like no other. He introduced me to Reggie Howard, who's in that photograph over there with a C in his hat. And he also showed me where the Memphis Red Sox had played, told me a lot of the history of Memphis, showed me where the black bourgeoisie lived, and he could be cantankerous, but he could also be very caring too. And I got to go to places that I never would have been able to go on my own. Gospel choirs, all these funky, great restaurants, and I was just in tow. If you've ever seen Foghorn Leghorn, the Bugs Bunny cartoon, boy, because he used to call me boy, you paying attention to me? And I only take color photographs, and at one point he called me Colored Boy, which I thought was pretty hilarious. But on my own, what I started doing was flying to a southern city, photographing their minor league team, and taking a bus to Memphis. I did it in Birmingham, Mobile, New Orleans, Montgomery. So I would get to go to that town. I have press privileges, or had them, wherever I wanted to go. See the museums and stuff, photograph baseball, and take a bus to see Ernest. What I didn't know was that he had a connection to Rickwood Field. I found Rickwood Field on the internet. I went there on my own, met the director. I had talked to him on the phone several times. Rickwood Field was no longer used by the public or by the minor league team, but once a year they had a fundraiser they called the Classic. David Brewer, the director, told me about it, and I made it a point to come back the next year. As it turns out, David had given me a publicity brochure. It was very fancy. It had a sample of what the flannel uniforms were like, and he gave me one to give to Ernest. Now, this photograph was in that book. So I brought the book back to Ernest, and he said, "Where did you get this? I haven't seen this picture in 30 years. Ernest took this. This is the 1948 Birmingham Black Barons, and if you look, you'll see a 17-year-old Willie Mays here, who they recruited out of high school. This was their only championship team in 1948. And I wasn't sure whether I could afford the print. He had several of them. And I said, "Ernest, how much do you get for your prints?" He said, "Oh, I don't know, $200, $250. And I came back the next day and said, "I'd like to buy that." He said, 50 cents. You just bought my wife breakfast. And that way, if somebody says, "Did you sell this?" I can say yes. So I was going to hang this here, but it's something I prize very greatly, and I wouldn't want to risk anything happening to it. It says on it, "To my friend of years, Ernest Withers." At the same time, we started Tony had gotten the go-ahead to work on a book of Ernest Negro League photographs, which bounced me down there. I have some friends that are historians, and we spent a lot of time working on it, which was another great experience. But shifting to Rickwood, around the turn of the century, the last century, ballparks were built in cities. The Industrial Revolution had started. The owners of the ballparks wanted a place where the workers could go and see grass, because they had all been transplanted to come to work in the mines and the steel mills, etc. Fenway Park, Yankee Stadium, Wrigley in Chicago, they all went up at the same time. Birmingham at one point was a steel magnet. The steel capital of America before Pittsburgh was. And the owner of the steel mill, Richard Woodward, decided to build a ballpark to give people a place to go after they were working in the mines, etc. So Rick Wood is actually just putting his name together. Richard Woodward became Rick Wood. It was built in 1910. At the time, there was no allowing any minority to play with a white team. Now, around this time, closer to 1920, African Americans formed their own teams and their own leagues. It was called the Negro Leagues. And very soon there were two divisions, just like in the other baseball, American and National League. And teams sprang up in most of the major cities, except Boston, of course. But what would happen is the white owners would rent the team to the Negro League team when they were out of town. So they would be generating income from their park and making use of it and collecting on the concessions. So Birmingham had the Birmingham Barons. Birmingham Black Barons became the Negro League team. New York had the New York Cuban Yankees, the New York Black Yankees. It was very common in the different cities to put together situations like this for teams. Now, the Birmingham Black Barons were a pretty nondescript team. They did not do well in the Western Negro League until 1948. And they won the championship this year. And Ernest used to take the bus from Memphis and go and photograph. The owner of the Birmingham Black Barons was a funeral director in Memphis, so he hired Ernest to do this. He would take the bus, take his photographs, he would go home, put a blanket over his kitchen, his bathroom window. He would develop the pictures, his wife would dry them in the oven. There probably are 3 people in here that remember it, but to get a glossy print in those days, you had to put it in contact with a shiny metal sheet, which gave it the gloss. And he and she would go back to the ballpark and sell them the next day. They were raising 8 kids, and Ernest was kind of a hellraiser himself. But he went on from that. Willie Mays came to the major leagues 3 years later. Ernest even took me to the home that the funeral director bought with the money he made from Willie Mays. But Rickwood, again, except for this year, was a fairly nondescript baseball. The Barons were a fairly nondescript team. In the late 50s, Brown versus the Board of Education gave the national law to desegregate schools. What happened in most of the South was children were sent to Catholic schools or private schools rather than go to a desegregated school. That was even further emphasized when more civil rights acts were passed in the early 60s. Birmingham had what was called the checkers law. You could not play or have any kind of activity with a person that wasn't of your race. You couldn't even play checkers with them. And that's where that name came from. 1963, Bull Connor, who was the civic manager and a man with such a vile hatred of African Americans, decided that rather than desegregate the pools and the events, he filled in all the pools in the city with dirt, so nobody could use them. In 1961, the Birmingham team had gone to play in Mobile. They weren't going to cross this line and try and find out what happened if they let black people play on their teams. Bull Connor left office in 1963. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have seen Charles Moore's pictures of German Shepherds being turned on kids, fire hoses so powerful being turned on school kids that it knocked them against walls. Birmingham had so many bombings of minorities, the nickname was Bombingham. The two gentlemen that meant to blow up a church at midnight did such a poor job with a fuse, it went off in the daytime and killed 4 young girls in the basement of the church. Because of all of this, Bull Connor was ridden out of town. And in 1964, the Birmingham Barons came back to play. One thing I didn't mention, that at Rickwood, you can see it over here in the seating chart from 1931, there were colored bleachers and colored grandstands that were covered with chicken wire. That's the only place where people of color could sit. It was referred to as the coal bin, like the crow's nest. In 1964, the owner said, "I've had enough of this," fielded the first integrated team in the South, and took down the chicken wire. He had to negotiate with the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan not to bomb the park on opening night. So that was actually a milestone in Southern history, and it went well. Fergie, where are you? Fergie Jenkins played for the Mobile team and pitched on the opening night. He went on to become a Hall of Famer. He was with the Cubs, and then he was with the Red Sox, as well as the Texas Rangers. So eventually, in 1964, Charlie O'Finley owned the team, who also owned the Kansas City Athletics, now the Oakland Athletics, and he had a good hand in this too. But a major group of ball players, Reggie Jackson, Rollie Fingers, Sal Bando, the core of the really great Oakland A's teams, all played at Rickwood. So the Barons muddled along till 1987, when they moved out of town to a new ballpark in the suburbs, and Rickwood just fell into disuse. A group of people called the Friends of Rickwood got together and did some preservation work at the park, and for the last 20 years, one day a year, the minor league team comes in from their park and plays a regulation game against another minor league team. They pick a period uniform. It could be a different year. Any of the teams that had farm teams down there, including the Red Sox, the Yankees, the Oakland Athletics, they play one game a year down there. And they bring in somebody who happened to be in the Southern Leagues to throw out the first pitch and sign autographs. Fergie was, Harmon Killebrew, Tommy John, Gaylord Perry, Dale Murphy. They come in, they sign autographs, and we get to hang out and talk. And I've been down to photograph the last 12 of these games. The 20th year of this will be next year. So it's going to be, the 100th anniversary there at the park was spectacular. They had over 10,000 people there. It was one big civic celebration, and Birmingham does have its problems. It's one of the most violent cities in America, along with Flint, Memphis, and New Orleans, but everybody seems to come to this game and enjoy themselves. It's like no other baseball game or sporting experience I've ever been to. The surviving Negro League players that can make it come to the game. People come from all over. And I was fortunate enough to just walk into it, and the coincidence that Ernest was there. I didn't mention it, but my father's name is William Ernest Chapman. He wouldn't name me William Ernest Chapman because he didn't want me to grow up being a junior. So otherwise, my alternate dad, I would have already had his name as a middle name. So, it's been a great time down there, and I've really devoted myself to the history of it. I thought maybe I shouldn't wear a shirt this ostentatious, but there are two parts to baseball. There's the entertainment that we all know, and then there's the history of it. And Bob Doyle over here and some people at Harvard were gracious enough to give me some funds so I could bring up one of these Negro League players, Reggie Howard over there, and the director of Rickwood Field, and have a conference about diversity there. I'd like to do more of that. We had a ball. Reggie's got such great stories. All these men have great stories, and what they went through in that period of time. And there are only 200 of them left. And Larry Lester, a historian, got Congress to pass a law stating if these guys could prove that they played for 4 years, then they would get Social Security money. And it's very difficult for them to do because there weren't real records kept. An African-American newspaper would come out once a week. They didn't often print scores, but there's a college kid in Arlington, Cam Perrone, who has made it his work to find these records of what he can, and he's gotten several of them the ability to collect Social Security. So I can go on and tell you stories about Ernest until the sun comes up 3 days from now. He was an amazing, amazing man, and Tony was fortunate enough to become in contact with him, and Tony certainly did help Ernest get books published and have exhibitions all over the world. And he treated me like a kid, like his son, which made sense because I was 30 years younger than he was. But I learned a lot from the man. He was at the autopsy of Martin Luther King, was offered a lot of money to send out a photograph of King being autopsied. He wouldn't do it. And he pulled the skin back on King's forehead to give him as much dignity as was possible. He took me to an old rundown pizza place in Memphis, and I thought, this is odd, but he wanted to take me where he was when he heard Kennedy was killed. He photographed every president from Kennedy on. He wouldn't go photograph George W. Bush because they wanted him to pay his own way, and he would have none of that. Very politically astute, very involved in local politics. He introduced me to a bunch of his cronies, and Ernest said, "This man's from Harvard," and one of the guys said, "Harvard Street, maybe." And I didn't know it at the time, but Harvard Street in Memphis is a real drug hangout, so it made it even funnier than it was when I heard that. He passed in 2007. He had asked me to speak at his funeral. It didn't quite happen that way, but he said, "I want people to say, 'Who's that big devil up there?'" And I said, "You mean the white devil?" He said, "Devil ain't got no color." And he was absolutely right. But I gladly take any questions. This is what I do. I have not photographed anybody you see here that I haven't had a conversation with. I don't just run up and do a candid or whatever it is other people do. That's fine. I just don't operate that way. So I've got 12 years worth of photographs. You see 22 here. I think Paula made a great selection of the ones that I gave to her to pick from. Rickwood Field, the game is the last week in May, so if you want details, it's worth a trip to Birmingham to go see. There's nothing like it in America. So, I think that's enough.
That's great.
Yeah. If anybody has any questions or wants to grab me later, I know a lot of books if you want to follow up on this. Particularly about Boston. There's Shut Out, the story of race and baseball in Boston by Howard Bryant. There's Carry Me Home by Diane McWhorter, who grew up during this period in Birmingham, and I learned an awful lot from that book. And there are several others besides, but I don't think we'll ever see another period in baseball history like the Barons or the Black Barons, and we'll certainly never see another man like Ernest. So, thank you all.
Thank you. available for sale. And Francis